Raindrops were hitting the window glass. Inside the house, laughter and the clinking of expensive dishes could be heard. The room smelled of expensive perfume and the softness of expensive carpets. But in a corner of the same house, a 7-year-old child was sitting with his head on his knees, crying. There were signs of hunger and exhaustion on his face. There were questions in his eyes that no one could answer. His father and mother were sitting at the magnificent dining table, talking about their next business trip. The wife looked at her husband and said, "I don't want this child to become an obstacle in our path of life. I don't want to throw the world we have worked so hard to build into some weeping mud." The husband said coldly, "Get him out of the house tomorrow morning." The next morning, the child was standing outside in the cold air with an old cloth bag. The door slammed shut behind him. He walked along the street, soaking in the rain, and with each step, a new wound appeared on his little heart. On the corner of the street, a dog sat next to him, as if feeling his pain. Days passed, hunger tore at his bones, his body shrank. His clothes became dirty and torn. People passed by, just glancing at him and moving on. Sometimes he would pick up small pieces of food from behind a hotel and eat them. Sometimes he would quench his thirst from a water bottle. One day he fell unconscious on the bank of a drain, rainwater running down his face, and his breathing was getting shallower. At that moment, a woman passing by saw him, but she just stopped and looked for a while, then took out her phone from her bag and moved on. A glimmer of hope appeared in the child's eyes for the last time, and then that glimmer gradually faded. The first rays of the sun gilded the city's wet streets, but the child who had spent the whole night by the canal did not have the strength to see this light. His lips were chapped, dark shadows around his eyes, and his body was shaking. He tried to get up slightly, but his weakness would make him fall back to the ground. At that moment, an old man pushing a cart passed by. His eyes fell on the child and he stopped walking. He bent down and said, "Son, what have you done?" The child could only say in a low voice, "I'm hungry." The old man took a stale loaf of bread from his cart and placed it in the child's hand. The child began to put the bread in his mouth with trembling hands. But as soon as he ate the first bite, tears flowed from his eyes. Perhaps it was not the taste of the bread, but the feeling that he had felt after a long time. Someone had spoken to him. The old man put him on his cart and brought him to his hut on the edge of the city. The hut was dilapidated, rainwater was dripping from the corner of the roof, but there was at least an old blanket and a tea kettle on the stove. At night, the child sat next to the old man and watched the lights on the street. A question kept nagging at him. "Will my parents miss me?" But there was only silence in response. Meanwhile, in an expensive restaurant in the city, his father and mother were clinking glasses of expensive wine and celebrating their success. The wife said to her husband, "Now we don't have to worry about any problems. That burden has been lifted from our lives." The husband smiled and nodded, but somewhere in the corner, perhaps for a moment, a slight twinge of pain pricked his heart, which he quickly suppressed. The night was deep, and the child was lying in the corner of the hut, about to fall asleep, when suddenly a strange shiver ran through his body. When the old man put his hand on his forehead, he was shivering. He was already in the grip of a fever, and this fever was the first knock of the coming storm. In the silence of the night, only the patter of rain could be heard. In the corner of the hut, the child was shivering with fever. His body was drenched in sweat and his lips were dry. The old man sat next to him, taking sips of water again and again, but he could only wet his lips with his weak hand. "Son, take courage. Nothing will happen to you," the old man said in a trembling voice, but the tears flowing from his eyes were expressing his helplessness. He took off his torn jacket and threw it over the child, as if the blanket would hold his life. By morning, the fever had increased even more. In a semi-conscious state, the child would sometimes call out his mother's name, sometimes call out to his father, but there was no response. His small hands waved aimlessly in the air, as if trying to hold someone, but they would fall into empty space. On the other hand, his father and mother were packing expensive suitcases for their business trip. The wife said to her husband. "What a peaceful life. No noise, no fuss." The husband smiled faintly, but for a moment, as if a child's weak voice rang in his ears. He nodded his head in agreement with his wife's words. In the evening, the old man took the child to a nearby old clinic. The doctor, seeing his condition, nodded. "He has been hungry for a long time and his body is very weak. If immediate and special treatment is not given, then this child may not live long." The old man felt in his pocket. There was nothing but a few coins. He pleaded with the doctor. "I am a laborer. Take the money later, just start treating him." The doctor said coldly. "Nothing can be done without a fee." The child rested his head on the old man's shoulder and said with a faint smile, "Uncle, I will be fine, right?" The old man couldn't say anything. He just stroked her head and prayed in his heart that maybe a miracle would happen. But fate probably had something else in mind. The night had fallen. A flickering lamp was burning in the hut, in whose dim light the old man was soaking the child's forehead with cold water. A strong wind was blowing outside, and a cold wave was coming inside. The child's breathing had become rapid and heavy. He repeatedly called his mother's name with a slight groan. "Mother, mother, take me home." The old man held his hand and said, "Son, this is your home. You are with me." But deep down he knew that this hut was not the child's real home. Suddenly a tear came out of the corner of the child's eye and flowed down his cheek. He looked at the old man with half-closed eyes and said in a weak voice, "Uncle, I'm tired. I can't walk anymore." The old man's hands started shaking. He straightened the child up in a panic. "No, son. Nothing will happen to you. Just have courage." At that moment, an expensive car pulled up in the far street. A couple in a beautiful dress got out of the car, laughing, as if they didn't have a care in the world. They were the child's parents. But they weren't here to see their son, but were returning from a close friend's party. The old man thought for a moment about running to them and saying, "This is your child. Save him." But he knew these people wouldn't listen. The door to his heart had long since closed. The child looked up at the sky for the last time, as if addressing someone unseen. "Mom, I'm coming." The old man immediately shook his hand. "Son, open your eyes. Son." And at that moment, that little hand loosened from the old man's palm. The old man started screaming and crying, the wind outside and the sound of the rain echoing on the soaked ground. He was looking out the door of the hut, but the street was empty. Just like this child's life. When the morning sun rose, there was a strange silence at the door of the hut. Inside, the old man was sitting with the little body of the child in his arms. He wrapped the child in an old dirty sheet, as if he were afraid that it might die of the cold again, although he knew that now that breath would never come back. The old man's eyes were red. He opened a wooden box kept in a corner of the hut, in which he had saved a few coins for years. These were the biggest savings of his life, and today they were all going to be spent on the burial of a child who was not even his own blood, but had become the closest to his heart. He walked through the streets with the child's body in his arms. People stopped to look, some would feel sorry, some would just take a look and drive away. At a corner of the street, the expensive car stopped, in which the child's father and mother were sitting. The wife looked at the hut owner, then chewed her lipstick-filled lips and said to her husband, "Hurry up, we're going to bed." The husband saw the small body wrapped in the old man's arms for a moment. It seemed familiar, but the next moment he looked away. The car door closed and she drove on. The old man reached the dirt road of the cemetery. He dug the dirt with his hands and gently handed the child to the ground. After burying him, he sat by the grave and looked up at the sky and said, "Master, this child may not have been precious to the people of the earth, but I hope it will become the most precious trust you have." That same night, the child's father and mother were laughing at a wonderful dinner in a large hotel in the city. But as soon as the wife picked up a glass of water, she saw her son's face in the reflection for a moment, the same weak, tired face. She panicked and put the glass on the table. The husband asked, shocked, "What happened?" He smiled falsely and said, "Nothing. Just an illusion." But neither of them had any idea that this illusion would rob them of sleep in the coming days. It was nighttime. The light from the expensive lamp was spreading in the large bedroom. The wife was standing in front of the mirror, removing her makeup, but as soon as she wiped her face with cotton, she saw a blurry reflection behind her in the mirror. Short, in dirty clothes, with a questioning look in her eyes. She turned around in panic. There was no one there. The husband was lying on the bed reading business reports. The wife said in a low voice, "Did you see that?" The husband raised his eyebrows. "What?" "That, like a child standing behind us." The husband laughed and said, "You're delusional." But a cold wave ran through his heart. The next day, the husband was finalizing a big deal in his office. While sitting in the conference room, his eyes suddenly fell on the street outside the window. A child was walking barefoot, empty-handed, and for a few moments he looked exactly like his son. The pen fell from the husband's hand. The colleagues asked in surprise, "Sir, are you okay?" He just nodded and changed the subject. That night, the two attended a magnificent party. The hall was sparkling with lights, laughter and music echoed in the air. But the wife's eyes kept looking towards the door, as if someone was about to enter. For a moment, she felt that her son was standing at the door, hungry and weak, watching her. Her heart beat fast. But there was only a waiter at the door. When they returned home, the wife sat quietly on the bed and said, "We have done wrong. Very wrong." The husband said sternly, "Let it end. What is done is done." But the peace that had once been a part of their lives was not on their faces. Luxury beds, expensive curtains, expensive lights. Despite everything, their hearts were wandering like in a deserted cemetery. That night, the two of them tried to sleep, tossing and turning, but a faint voice echoed in the air outside the window, like a child softly saying, "Mommy, Dad." Evening was falling. The drawing room was lit by softly burning scented candles. The wife was sitting on the sofa trying to read a book, but the words were blurry. Suddenly, she felt a small hand lightly tap her shoulder. She turned around in surprise. No one was there. At that moment, the sound of a plate falling came from the kitchen. She ran over, but the plate was placed perfectly still on the counter. Then she felt someone softly call her name, the exact same tone as her son's. The husband came home from a business meeting and went straight to his study. As soon as he opened his laptop, an old family photo appeared on the screen, the same one in which his son was smiling. The husband was shocked and closed it, but the image kept coming back to the screen. Finally, he closed the laptop and took a deep breath, but his heart was beating fast. The two sat in silence at dinner. The food on the plate remained untouched. The wife said in a low voice, "Have you felt it too? Like he is with us? Somewhere close?" The husband lowered his eyes. "Yes, but it is just a game of our minds." That night, while the wife was sleeping, she saw her son in her dream. He was standing on the corner of the street, soaking wet in the rain, the same old sadness in his eyes and the question on his lips. "Mom, what did I do wrong?" The wife woke up screaming, drenched in sweat. The husband also woke up and held her hands. "What happened?" she cried. "He came to me in my dream, and I could not speak." Both of them were now convinced that the child must have left them, but his pain and his presence were with them every moment. It was morning. The husband was sitting at the dining table to eat breakfast when he suddenly saw the toast on his plate fall to the ground, as if someone had deliberately pushed it. He bent down in shock, but there was nothing there. A strange panic settled in his heart. The wife was combing her hair in front of the mirror, but as soon as she ran a comb through her hair, she heard a faint whisper near her ear. "Mom!" The comb fell from her hand. She turned around, but there was only silence in the room. In the afternoon, the husband decided to stay home instead of going to the office. The wife asked in surprise, "There was no meeting today?" The husband glanced away and said, "I don't feel like going out." The two looked into each other's eyes, and a silence fell, as if they both knew who they were running from, but that presence was embedded in the walls of the house. At night, both of them were lying on the bed, but sleep was far from their eyes. Suddenly, a slight creaking sound began to come from under the bed. The husband dared to look down, but the floor was empty. Then the light in the room dimmed automatically, and a shadow standing in the corner slowly began to take shape. It was the shadow of a child who was looking at them. The wife's breath caught. This is our son." The husband held his wife with a trembling hand, but the next moment, that shadow gradually faded and the room became normal again. Both of their hearts were pounding. Sweat was pouring down their foreheads. The wife said in a low voice, "What we did, he will never forgive us." The husband took a deep breath. "Or else, we will never forgive ourselves." Light raindrops were falling on the glass. Looking out the large window of the drawing room, the husband closed the business files for the first time in many days. His wife was sitting in front of him with a cup of tea, but their eyes were not meeting each other. "Have you noticed?" the wife said slowly. "What? Our life seems to have stopped. Now there is no fun in deals, no excitement in parties." The husband shook his head slowly. "Because inside we are dead." That day, both of them cancelled all meetings with the office and friends. The whole day there was a strange silence in the house. The shadow of the son's memory could be felt in every room. When the wife went to the kitchen, it seemed as if a small step was following her. When the husband sat in his study, he would suddenly have the illusion of his son's old toy on the table. At night, the wife plucked up courage and said, "We should go to his grave." The husband looked at her in shock. "Are you crazy?" "I was crazy when we kicked her out of the house. Now maybe we should go to her and apologize." The husband fell silent, but a storm had already risen inside his heart. He knew that going to this grave would not be just a visit, but perhaps the day when both of them would have to face the truth. That night, the wife sees her son in her dream. He is sitting by the grave, playing with the mud, and when she moves to hug him, he steps back and says, "It's too late, Mom." The wife wakes up screaming. When her husband comes to her, she says in a trembling voice, "We are going to the grave tomorrow, no matter what." There was a strange solemnity in the cool morning air. The two were sitting in the same car and going towards the silent cemetery. On the way, neither of them spoke nor looked at each other, as if the words had died away. The wife's steps were shaking as she walked along the deserted path of the cemetery. She looked around repeatedly, as if she were looking for someone. The husband's breathing was getting heavy. Finally, they stopped in front of a small grave. An old man was sitting near the grave, the same hut owner who had supported their son in his last days. In his hand was a small toy that had once belonged to the child. As soon as he saw the parents, such bitterness and sadness flashed in his eyes that both of them stopped walking automatically. "This was your son," the old man said in a deep voice. "I gave him as much support as I could in my poverty. But you didn't even give him what is given to an animal." The wife's hands began to tremble, and tears began to flow uncontrollably from her eyes. She bent down near the grave and touched the soil, as if it contained the warmth of her son's last breaths. "My son, forgive me." Suddenly a gust of wind came, and a few dried flowers placed on the grave flew away and landed at her feet. The husband picked up the flowers and looked at them for a long time. The corners of his eyes became heavy like wet soil. The old man said slowly, "His soul is not at peace. You thought that life would be easier even after breaking his heart. But sometimes a broken prayer does not leave its trail for a lifetime." The wife hugged the grave, and the husband stood silently, but for the first time that emptiness broke on his face, and 2 drops flowed from his eyes. At that moment, both of them realized that this grave was not just a pile of dirt, but the burden of their sin, and they would never be able to bear this burden for the rest of their lives. There was a deep silence inside the car as they were returning from the cemetery. The wife was looking out the window, but the scene kept appearing in her eyes. the son's unmarked grave, the old man's words, and the cold soil he had pressed to his chest. The husband was driving, but his hands were also trembling slightly. Upon reaching home, both of them took off their expensive shoes and threw them on the floor. Neither of them asked for food, nor did anyone change their clothes. The wife went straight to her bedroom and took out a box of her son's old clothes and placed them in front of her. She held a small shirt to her face and sniffed it for a long time, as if it still contained her son's scent. The husband went to the study room and stared at the row of business awards kept there for a long time. Every trophy, every certificate now seemed meaningless to him. In an instant, he pushed everything into the closet and closed the door. That night, the dining table was empty. Both of them were lying on the bed, but there was no sign of sleep. The wife said slowly, "I felt his lips smiling at the grave today, as if saying that now you too will experience the same loneliness that I felt." The husband changed his mind. "Yes, and this loneliness will now be a part of our whole lives." The next day, both of them stopped going to the office. The phone kept ringing, but they did not pick up. Friends called, but they did not talk to anyone. In the silence of the house, sometimes the faint sound of footsteps could be heard, sometimes the echo of laughter, but they knew that this was not just a product of their minds. In the evening, the wife said to her husband, "This life of ours, luxury, money, everyone ends it. Maybe we will get her peace back." The husband took a deep breath. "Maybe, but I know her soul will still not leave us." At that moment, the light in the room automatically went out. In the darkness, both of them heard a small voice. "Ami, Baba." Their hearts seemed to freeze in their chests. The rain had stopped, but the heavy silence inside the house had not been broken. The husband was standing by the window, lighting cigarettes over and over again, and the wife was sitting on the sofa, staring blankly at the wall. The wife said softly, "We will never be able to escape this torment, unless we face it." The husband turned around and looked. "Whose face?" "His soul. We have to apologize to him." "Really? And until he forgives us, we will not be able to live comfortably." The husband took a deep breath. "And if he doesn't forgive?" The wife's eyes filled with tears. "Then we will go to him too." This sentence echoed in the room. The husband lowered his eyes. At that moment, both of them knew that they could no longer return to normal life. The next day, they both went to the cemetery again, their steps heavy as they walked in the mud after the rain. As they approached the grave, a strong gust of wind blew and the branches of the trees began to shake violently. The same old man sitting on the grave was watching them, but this time there was surprise in his eyes. The wife knelt down by the grave, touched the soil and closed her eyes, saying, "Son, we are your murderers. Forgive us. We want to leave everything and come to you." The old man's face changed. "Have you gone crazy? This path will not give you peace. It will take you into darkness forever." The husband placed flowers on the grave and said in a low voice, "We are already living in darkness. Now I just want that darkness to pass with him." At that moment, the wife felt as if she heard a faint laugh near her ear, the same one her son used to have when he was a child. She shivered but tried to smile. The old man said sternly, "You do not know the outcome of what you are thinking. Peace of mind will not come from your death, but from your living and letting others live." But a decision had been made in their hearts. A decision that would either free their souls or imprison them forever. It was nighttime. There was only a dim light in the house, and strong gusts of wind outside were rattling the window panes. The wife was sitting in the kitchen writing a letter. Her hands were shaking, but the words were being written clearly. "This is all the result of our sins. We are going to our son." The husband was sitting in the study closing his business accounts. He put all the files aside, cut up his passport and cards and threw them away, as if he were breaking his identity and every connection with the world. The wife finished the letter and placed it in front of her husband. The two looked at each other in silence. There was fear in their eyes and a strange peace, as if they had embraced the end. They decided to go to their son's grave, and planned to end their lives there. The husband prepared a small bag, which contained only his son's old toy, a sheet, and a bottle of water for both of them. The next morning, both of them left all the doors open. Everything in the house was as if someone was coming back. But they knew they would never come back. There was an unusual silence in the air until they reached the cemetery. It was as if the air itself was holding its breath and watching them. The wife sat down near the grave, and the husband knelt down beside her. The wife said in a low voice, "We're here, son. We'll never leave you alone again." The husband opened the bottle, but before he could take the last step, a sudden gust of cold air came and the soil near the grave began to shake. The toy fell from the wife's hand to the ground, and a low, familiar laugh echoed in the air. The wind suddenly picked up. The branches of the trees began to shake violently, as if someone was passing through them. The soil above the grave began to tremble slightly, and the wife's eyes widened in fear. "Did you see this?" she said to her husband in a trembling voice. The husband took a deep breath. "Yes, I saw it." The toy, which had fallen from the wife's hand, slowly and naturally moved closer to the grave and stopped, as if someone had pulled it there. The wife's lips trembled, and she held her husband's hand tightly. Suddenly, a faint laugh rang out, the same laugh that they both had heard from their son years ago. This laugh was getting closer now, and with it a cold, cold presence was spreading around them. The wife touched the soil of the grave with tears in her eyes. "Son, we have come to you, now take us with you." A whisper was heard in the breeze. "It's too late, Mom." The husband's hands were numb. He felt as if a small hand had grabbed his arm, cold, lifeless, but hard. He shivered. Suddenly, the old man appeared behind the grave. There was panic on his face. "What are you two doing? Go back now. Don't you think that the spirit will take you to a place from which you will never return?" The wife ignored him and opened the bottle. But as soon as she took a step forward, a loud sighing sound came from under the ground, a sound as if someone had released years of sorrow in an instant. The roar of the wind, the rustling of the trees, and that familiar laughter combined to drown the cemetery in an eerie silence. The soil above the grave was shaking rapidly, as if someone was restless below. There was a strange chill in the air, and the bottle slipped from the wife's hand and fell to the ground. The husband's heart was beating fast, but he held on to his wife. Suddenly, a mist began to rise from the grave. This mist slowly began to take on a human form, a small body, a bent thin neck, and the same face, their son. There was no longer the innocence in his eyes that had once been there, but an emptiness and a cold anger. "Mom, Dad," he said in a low voice, "why have you come now? Where were you when I needed you the most?" The wife's tears were not stopping. She continued, "Son, we made a mistake. Forgive us, we want to be with you." A bitter smile appeared on the son's lips. "Do you want to be with me? So come. But there is no happiness here. There is only the pain you gave." The husband held his wife's hand tightly, but at that moment the son's matted fingers came to rest on both of their hands. A cold wave ran through their bodies. As their feet froze in the ground, their breathing became heavy. The old man shouted, "Step back! It will take you with it." But it was too late. The mist deepened on the son's face, and in an instant the three of them were enveloped in a cold, colorless mist. The mist disappeared with a strong gust of wind. Only silence and dried flowers remained above the grave. The old man approached the grave, but there was no sign of the parents. It is said that after that day, whenever the wind passes through the cemetery, 3 voices are heard, 1 innocent and 2 heavy. "Mother, Father." The cemetery became even more deserted after that day. The villagers said that as evening fell, a strange coolness spread there, as if someone had taken a breath from under the ground. The old man, who had been the child's last support, came to his grave every day. But now there was not just 1 but 3 graves, the child's in the middle and his parents on either side. No one ever came to read the Fatiha on these graves, but the flowers were always fresh, placed by an unseen hand. At night, the old man would sometimes sit quietly by the 3 graves and listen to the faint whispers. In them, the child's innocent voice was mixed with the parents' faint, broken words, as if they were still apologizing to him. And the child was listening silently. A story became famous among the village children. Whoever goes to this grave and curses his parents in his heart, his voice reaches the three spirits buried there. And after a few days, strange accidents begin to happen in his house. The old man thought many times about leaving this cemetery, but he had a feeling in his heart. Perhaps he is the only witness to these three, and if he also leaves, this story will be lost in the fog. One night, when the moon was full and the light was spreading over the cemetery, the old man saw three dim shadows from afar, one small, two large, standing in the middle of the graves. They were holding each other's hands and looking up at the sky, and then slowly disappeared. The old man closed his eyes and sighed. Maybe they have found peace now, or maybe this is just the beginning. It was past midnight. Aram sat between the three graves, looking around in the dim light of the lantern. The wind had stopped completely, as if the entire cemetery was watching him with bated breath. Suddenly, a soft whisper was heard on the recorder. "Why are you looking for us?" Aram said, approaching the microphone with trembling hands. "I want to hear your story." Immediately after that, another voice came, this time closer, heavier. "Those who hear this story do not live." The light from the lantern flickered and went out. In the darkness, Aram heard footsteps behind him. Small and light like a child's. Then two heavy footsteps like an adult approaching. "Mom, does he want to be with us too?" The child's innocent but hoarse voice rang out. "Yes, son, but first look, he wouldn't run away in fear." It was a woman's cold and faint voice. A shiver ran down Aram's legs. He got up and started to back away, but suddenly his foot hit something soft. Looking down, he saw fresh flowers on the ground, which had not been there a moment before. Then suddenly, all three voices came together. "Come with us." A cold hand in the darkness touched his wrist. He screamed and backed away, trying to relight the lantern. When the light came on, there was no one in front. Breathing heavily, Aram turned off the recorder and ran out of the cemetery. But as he crossed the gate, a final whisper rang in his ear. "We have recognized you. You will return." From that day on, wherever Aram went, he would sometimes see three dim shadows in a mirror. Sometimes someone would wake him up in his sleep by calling his name. And every night the same voice would ring in his ear. "Now you are ours too." Aram decided that he would leave this cemetery and this village forever. The next morning, he packed his things and returned to the city. But even in the city lights, he could not find peace. The first night, he was lying in his flat when he heard the sound of a plate falling from the kitchen. He ran over, the plate perfectly placed on the floor, but in the middle of it was the same fresh flower he had seen on the grave. The second night, he was fixing his hair in the mirror when he saw three blurry shadows behind him. He turned around, the room was empty. But the shadows were still there in the mirror, slowly approaching. There was no peace in the office either. During a meeting, an old photo came up in his file, a child and two large hands on his shoulders. He had never taken that photo. In the afternoon, a colleague said, "Aram, who was behind you just now?" "I saw three people reflected in the mirror." The pen fell from Aram's hand. He started taking sleeping pills, but when he did fall asleep, he would only dream of the same thing. That cemetery, those three graves, and the same voice. "You will come back." The last time he woke up, the window of his room was open, and there were tiny footprints on the floor, coming straight to his bed. And at the head of the bed, the same toy that had belonged to the child. Aram's breath caught. Now he knew that no matter where he went, the three of them would be with him. Aram had made up his mind. He would go back to the cemetery. Even if it meant losing his life. He wanted to escape this shadow. In the darkness of the night, he reached the cemetery with a flashlight and a recorder. When he stood in front of the three graves, the air was already heavy. The wind stopped blowing as if time had stopped. "I'm here," Aram shouted loudly. "Do whatever you have to do. Just end this pursuit." There was silence for a few moments. Then the soil of the grave began to shake. The fog slowly lifted and stood in front of him in the form of a child and two adults. This time there was no anger in the child's eyes, only a strange seriousness. "You chose to come yourself," the child said. Aram bowed his head and said, "Yes, I want this to all end." The child stepped forward, placing his cool hand on his forehead. In an instant, everything flashed before Aram's eyes. The child's hunger, the illness, the parents' regret, and the loneliness of their graves. Then a blurry scene emerged. Aram found himself standing in the middle of the cemetery with the three of them. There was a thick fog around him, and there was no way out. The old man's voice came from somewhere far away. "I said, once these graves recognize you, you will become theirs." The next morning, the villagers were passing by the cemetery and they were surprised to see. Now there were 4 graves. 3 old and 1 brand new. There were no names on it. Only an old recorder was kept, in which the same sentence was playing over and over again. "I have arrived."